Before we delve into tonight's story, a cautionary tale of a father's love twisted into a desperate rage, I want to ask you to do one small thing. If you enjoy stories that explore the darkest corners of human emotion, that make you question the very nature of justice, then please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Click that bell icon too so you never miss an update. Your support allows me to keep bringing you these narratives. Now, prepare yourselves. What you are about to hear is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most ordinary people can be pushed to the most extraordinary and terrifying of limits. The world, for Michael, had always been a place of blueprints and certainties. As an architect, he dealt in angles, in load-bearing walls, and in the unwavering laws of physics. His life, much like the houses he designed, was built on a solid foundation, a foundation poured with the concrete of love for his only daughter, Amelia. Since his wife had passed away a decade prior, Amelia had become the sun around which his entire existence orbited. Every late night he'd spent hunched over drafts. Every weekend sacrifice to client meetings had been for her. And she, in turn, had been the perfect daughter, a reflection of all his hopes and dreams. Amelia was a symphony of talent and grace. She'd inherited her mother's artistic flair and his own meticulous attention to detail. At 23, she had just graduated from a prestigious university with a degree in art history, her name at the very top of her class. Her dissertation on the chiaroscuro techniques of the late Renaissance had been lauded by her professors as groundbreaking. A future as a renowned curator or a respected academic seemed not just a possibility, but a certainty. Michael had never been prouder. The day she received a job offer from the esteemed Sterling Gallery, one of the most respected art institutions in the country, felt like the culmination of his life's work. They had celebrated with champagne, the bubbles in their glasses seeming to fizz with the effervescence of their shared joy. The world was at Amelia's feet, a gilded path stretching out before her. But gilded cages, for all their beauty, are still cages. And the world outside their carefully constructed life was a far more chaotic and unpredictable place than either of them could have imagined. It was a world that contained men like Julian Thorne. Julian was a journalist, or at least that's what he called himself. In reality, he was a purveyor of outrage, a digital age muckraker who thrived on the currency of clicks and shares. He worked for a local online news outlet called The City Beat, a publication that had long ago traded journalistic integrity for sensationalism. Julian's articles were a cocktail of half-truths, innuendo, and carefully selected quotes, all designed to provoke a reaction, to get people talking, and most importantly, to get them clicking. He was a master of his craft, and he was always on the hunt for his next big story. He found it in the form of a bitter, anonymous email. The sender, who claimed to be a fellow graduate of Amelia's, painted a picture of a young woman who had used her looks and a feigned naivety to get ahead. The email alleged that Amelia's relationship with one of the senior partners at the Sterling Gallery, a man who had been a guest lecturer at her university, was far from professional. It was a lie, a vicious and unfounded rumor born of jealousy. But for Julian, it was gold. He didn't need proof, he just needed plausibility. He just needed to plant the seed of doubt. His article, published under the headline Art of the Steal, How a Young Graduate Bypassed the Competition, was a masterpiece of character assassination. He never explicitly stated that Amelia had slept her way to the top, but he didn't have to. He used phrases like, a close and personal relationship, and questions have been raised about the nature of their mentorship. He quoted the anonymous source, who spoke of Amelia's unusual confidence, and her ability to charm her way into any situation. He even managed to find a photo of Amelia and the partner from a university event, cropped in such a way that it made them look more intimate than they were. The article was a digital wildfire. It spread through their community with terrifying speed, shared on social media by people who knew Amelia, and by thousands who didn't. The comments section was a cesspool of vitriol and misogyny. Amelia was branded a slut, a manipulator, a fraud. Her carefully curated online presence was flooded with hateful messages. The gilded cage had been shattered, and the world had come rushing in, a torrent of ugliness and hate. At first, Michael was in disbelief. It was so absurd, so far from the truth of who his daughter was, that he couldn't comprehend how anyone could believe it. But the phone calls started coming. Friends of the family, offering their support in hushed, pitying tones. Then the call from the Sterling Gallery. They were postponing Amelia's start date, pending an internal review. The carefully constructed world he had built for his daughter was starting to crumble. He tried to fight back. He contacted the City Beat, demanding a retraction. He was met with a wall of corporate indifference. They stood by their story, they said. They had a source. He hired a lawyer, a man in a crisp suit who spoke in grim, practical terms about the difficulties of proving libel and the astronomical costs of a legal battle. Michael felt a sense of powerlessness he had never known before, a frustration that was beginning to curdle into a cold, hard knot of anger in his stomach. But his own pain was nothing compared to watching what this was doing to Amelia. The vibrant, confident young woman he had raised was disappearing before his eyes. She stopped eating, she stopped sleeping. She would spend hours just staring at her phone, her face illuminated by the endless scroll of hateful comments. The light in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a dull, hollow emptiness. She was a prisoner in her own home, the online world a constant, inescapable tormentor. One evening, Michael found her in her room, a pair of scissors in her hand, her beautiful, long hair, the hair he had brushed and braided for her when she was a little girl, lying in jagged clumps on the floor. She had been crying, her face a mask of despair. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a pain that pierced him to the core. "They all hate me, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They all think I'm a terrible person." In that moment, something inside Michael broke. The architect, the man of reason and logic, was gone. In his place was a father who saw his child in agony, a father who felt a primal, all-consuming need to protect her. The cold knot of anger in his stomach began to burn, a white-hot rage that demanded an outlet. He looked at his weeping daughter, at the wreckage of her dreams, and he knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that he would do anything to make the person responsible for this pay. The world of blueprints and certainties was gone, replaced by a landscape of shadows and rage. And in the heart of that landscape, a single thought began to take root, a dark and dangerous seed in the fertile ground of a father's broken heart. Julian Thorne must be stopped. The days that followed were a descent into a gray, suffocating fog. The once vibrant home, a space Michael had designed to be filled with light and air, now felt like a tomb. Amelia rarely left her room, the curtains drawn tight against a world that had become a source of unrelenting cruelty. The online harassment had not abated. If anything, it had intensified, a digital mob that fed on its own frenzy. Every notification on Amelia's phone was a potential new wound, every email a new vessel for poison. Michael's attempts to shield her were futile. The poison was already in her veins, seeping into her spirit, corroding the bright, confident young woman she had been. The final, crushing blow came in the form of a sterile, corporate email from the Sterling Gallery. After a brief internal review, they had decided to rescind their offer of employment. The email was a masterpiece of legal jargon, carefully worded to avoid any admission of wrongdoing. But the message was clear. Amelia was now toxic, a liability they were unwilling to take on. The dream job, the culmination of years of hard work and dedication, had vanished into the ether of online rumor and corporate cowardice. The news broke Amelia in a way that terrified Michael. There were no more tears, no more rage, just a profound and terrifying emptiness. She became a ghost in her own home, her movements slow and listless, her eyes vacant. Michael would try to talk to her, to coax her out of her room, but his words seemed to pass through her, unheard and unheeded. He would cook her favorite meals, only to find them untouched hours later. The silence in the house was a living thing, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to suffocate all hope. As his daughter faded, Michael's rage found a focus, a name, and a face: Julian Thorne. The journalist became an obsession. Michael spent his nights not at his drafting table, but in the blue glow of his computer screen, an amateur detective hunting his prey in the digital wilderness. He read every article Julian had ever written, a litany of sensationalized stories that left a trail of ruined lives in their wake. He pieced together Julian's life from his social media presence, the trendy bars he frequented, the gym he belonged to, the self-congratulatory posts about his impactful journalism. He saw a man who was not just indifferent to the pain he caused, but who seemed to revel in it. A man who saw human lives as nothing more than raw material for his clickbait headlines. Michael's heart, already fractured with grief for his daughter, hardened into something he no longer recognized. The gentle, reasonable man he had always been was being consumed by a dark, vengeful doppelganger. His friends, the few he still had the energy to see, noticed the change. They saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled with a barely suppressed rage. They urged him to let it go, to focus on Amelia, to seek professional help. But their well-meaning advice felt like a betrayal. They didn't understand. They couldn't see the wreckage of his daughter's life. They couldn't feel the molten fury that now coursed through his veins. How could he let it go? Letting it go felt like letting Julian win, like admitting that his daughter's life, her dreams, her very soul were worthless. He started following Julian not just online but in the real world. He would park his car down the street from the City Beat offices, watching the journalist come and go, his face a mask of casual indifference. He would sit in the corner of a coffee shop, his newspaper a flimsy shield, as Julian laughed with his colleagues, completely oblivious to the man whose world he had shattered. Each time he saw him, the rage inside Michael grew, a pressure building behind a dam that was threatening to burst. He had several opportunities to confront him. He once followed him into a parking garage, his hand gripping the tire iron in his trunk. He had pictured the scene 1,000 times in his mind. The confrontation, the fear in Julian's eyes, the satisfying crunch of bone. But he had always pulled back, a flicker of his old self, of the man who believed in reason and the rule of law, holding him in check. He was a father, a protector, not a monster. But that line, the line between protector and monster, was becoming increasingly blurred. His obsession was taking its toll. He was neglecting his work, his clients growing impatient with his missed deadlines and unreturned calls. His own world, the world of blueprints and certainties, was collapsing around him, a mirror image of what had happened to his daughter. He was losing everything, and it all led back to one man. The breaking point, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, soul-crushing moment of realization. He had found a box of Amelia's old art supplies in the back of a closet. Canvases, brushes, a set of expensive oil paints he had bought her for her 18th birthday. He had brought them to her room, a desperate hope that he could rekindle some spark of her former self. She had looked at the box with those empty, vacant eyes, and then had looked at him. "I can't," she had whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "I don't know who I am anymore." The words had been a physical blow. He had stumbled out of her room, his chest tight, the box of art supplies feeling as heavy as a coffin in his hands. He had gone to his own room and had wept, not just for his daughter, but for the man he used to be, the man who could fix things, who could build things, who could protect his child from the world. That man was gone, and in his place was a man consumed by a single terrifying thought. If the world would not give him justice, he would have to take it himself. The dam was about to break, and the flood of rage that would be unleashed would sweep away everything in its path. The final thread of Michael's restraint snapped with the publication of Julian's follow-up article. It was titled "The Price of Ambition, A Family's Silent Confession," and it was, if possible, even more insidious than the first. Julian, with a feigned tone of concern, wrote about Amelia's withdrawal from public life, framing it not as the result of a vicious campaign of online harassment, but as a tacit admission of guilt. He painted Michael's desperate attempts to clear his daughter's name as the actions of an overbearing father trying to cover up a family's shame. He had taken their pain, their private agony, and had twisted it into another sordid spectacle for public consumption. For Michael, it was the ultimate violation. Julian had not just destroyed his daughter's future. He was now dancing on the grave of her spirit, desecrating her name for a few more clicks. The article was a calculated act of cruelty, a final, arrogant twist of the knife. And it was then that Michael knew his internal battle was over. The man of reason had been silenced, and the avenging father was now in complete control. He drove not to his office, but to a hardware store on the industrial outskirts of the city. He walked through the aisles, past the neatly organized rows of tools and equipment, his movements calm and deliberate. He purchased a utility knife, the kind with a long, retractable blade. The cashier, a young man with a bored expression, barely glanced at him as he paid in cash. The knife felt heavy in his pocket, a cold, hard promise of what was to come. There was no clear plan in his mind, no detailed blueprint. There was only a destination, Julian Thorne. He waited in his car, parked across the street from the offices of the City Beat. He watched as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the city. He didn't feel nervous, he didn't feel scared. He felt a strange, unnerving sense of calm, the calm that comes when all other options have been exhausted, when there is only one path left to take. At a little after 6 o'clock, Julian emerged from the building, a phone pressed to his ear, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was laughing, a sound that grated on Michael's raw nerves. Michael got out of his car, the crumpled follow-up article in one hand, the utility knife a cold weight in the other. He approached Julian, his step steady, his eyes locked on his target. "Julian Thorne," he said, his voice low and even. Julian looked up, his expression shifting from amusement to annoyance. "Do I know you?" "You destroyed my daughter," Michael said, holding out the crumpled article. "You destroyed her life with your lies." Julian's face hardened. He recognized the story, and a flicker of recognition, not of guilt, but of professional pride, crossed his features. "Look, buddy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I just report the facts. If your daughter has a problem with the truth, that's not my fault. Now, if you'll excuse me." He made to walk away, but Michael stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere," Michael said, his voice a low growl. "You're going to listen to me." "Get out of my way," Julian said, his arrogance turning to aggression. He pushed Michael in the chest. "Or I'll call the cops." And that was it. The push, the casual dismissal, the complete lack of remorse. It was the spark that ignited the gasoline. The world went red. The calm shattered, replaced by a roaring, all-consuming rage. Michael's hand went to his pocket, the utility knife feeling like a natural extension of his arm. He lunged, a guttural cry of anguish and fury tearing from his throat. He stabbed Julian once, twice, 3 times for times. He didn't aim for any particular spot. He just struck, again and again, the blade sinking into the soft flesh of Julian's abdomen and chest. The journalist's eyes went wide with shock and pain, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He stumbled backward, his hands going to his wounds, a dark, crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He collapsed onto the pavement, his body a crumpled heap. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The city seemed to hold its breath. Then the screaming started. A woman who had been walking down the street, her face a mask of horror. A man in a nearby car, fumbling for his phone. The world came rushing back into focus for Michael. He looked down at the knife in his hand, at the blood that was now on his clothes, at the man bleeding out on the sidewalk. The rage receded as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of shock. What had he done? He didn't run. He just stood there, the knife falling from his nerveless fingers and clattering onto the pavement. He was still standing there, his face a blank mask of disbelief, when the first police car arrived, its sirens wailing, its red and blue lights painting the scene in garish, frantic strokes. The aftermath was a blur of handcuffs, of Miranda rights being read in a detached, robotic voice, of being pushed into the back of a police car. The story, which had started with his daughter, was now about him. Father stabs journalist 4 times after daughter's reputation smeared. It was a headline that Julian Thorne himself would have been proud of. Julian survived after hours of emergency surgery. Michael was charged with attempted murder. The trial was a media circus, the very thing he had come to despise. His actions were debated and dissected on news channels and in online forums. Some called him a monster, a violent criminal who had taken the law into his own hands. Others, a small but vocal minority, saw him as a tragic hero, a father pushed to the brink by a corrupt and heartless media. But in the end, none of it mattered. He was found guilty, the cold, impartial logic of the law overriding the emotional complexities of his case. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The last time he saw Amelia was through the thick, reinforced glass of a prison visiting room. She looked older, her face etched with a pain and a guilt that he knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was no longer a victim. She was now the daughter of a convicted felon, her name forever linked to his crime. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. He looked at his daughter, the person he had loved more than life itself, the person he had tried so desperately to protect, and he saw that in his quest for vengeance, he had only succeeded in building a new, more terrible cage around her. "I know," he said, his own voice thick with a regret so profound it felt like a physical weight on his soul. "I am too." He was led back to his cell, a small concrete box that was now his world. He had fought a monster, and in the end he had become one. There had been no justice, no reckoning. There was only the silence, the guilt, and the devastating knowledge that in his desperate attempt to save his daughter, he had destroyed them both. 5 years is both a long time and no time at all. It's long enough for the flesh of a wound to knit itself back together, but far too short to erase the scars left on the soul. In those 5 years, the world had moved on, the news cycle churning out new tragedies and new scandals. But for the 3 people bound together by one violent autumn afternoon, time had fractured. For Michael, time was a gray ocean of monotony. Life in the state penitentiary was an endless loop of bells, head counts, and cold concrete walls. The white-hot rage of a father, which had once consumed him, had long since cooled, leaving only the cold ashes of a profound and abiding regret. He was no longer an architect, a man who could bend the world to his precise designs. He was a number, an inmate, a cautionary tale whispered by guards to new arrivals. In the long, quiet hours of the night, he would lie on his cot, stare at the ceiling, and rebuild their home in his mind. Not the physical structure, but the life he had built for Amelia. Every detail was perfect, every memory precious, and every time, he would arrive at the moment it all came crashing down. He didn't regret loving his daughter. That love was the only real thing in this gray ocean. But he regretted his hubris, the belief that violence could heal a wound, that destroying another man could piece his daughter's world back together. He had been wrong, a catastrophic miscalculation that had cost him his freedom and placed a new, heavier burden on the very person he had sought to protect. For Amelia, the 5 years had been a journey of reclamation. After the trial, she had left the city, escaping the pitying glances and the toxic whispers. She changed her last name, a small but symbolic act of severance from the past. The name Amelia, once destined for a bright future in the art world, was now inextricably linked to scandal and crime. The gilded cage had been shattered, and instead of trying to rebuild it, she had walked away from the wreckage. She moved to a small coastal town where no one knew her story. She didn't work in pristine galleries anymore. Instead, she found a new purpose in an unlikely place, a local community center where she started an art therapy class for troubled teenagers. There, amid the jars of paint and stacks of sketch paper, she discovered that art was not just something to be admired in quiet spaces. It was a tool for healing, for expressing what could not be spoken. She saw a piece of herself in these kids, their anger, their hurt, their feeling of being misunderstood by the world. She taught them how to channel their pain into color and their chaos into form. And in the process of helping them heal, she slowly began to heal herself. The old life felt like a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there, especially on late nights when she'd look at a beautiful painting and wonder what if. But then she would look at the raw, emotional drawings of her students, and she would know she was exactly where she needed to be. And for Julian Thorne, the 5 years had been a renaissance. The attack had transformed him from a local sensationalist into a national figure. He became a martyr for free speech, a symbol of the dangers of speaking truth to power. At least, that was the narrative he sold. He wrote a best-selling book about his ordeal, titled The Bleeding Edge, a reporter's fight for truth in a world of lies. He appeared on talk shows, his scars displayed deliberately like badges of honor. He spoke of the importance of a fearless press, while skillfully glossing over the ethical void of his own methods. He had monetized the tragedy he had created, turning the Michael's pain into his career's capital. He had survived and he had thrived, but it had come at a cost. He was paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. He had a state-of-the-art security system in his new luxury penthouse. The attack had left scars not just on his body, but on his psyche, a lingering fear that one day, another face in the crowd might step forward to collect a debt. Their final convergence was not in a courtroom or on a news report, but in quieter, more profound ways. Amelia visited her father twice a year. Each trip was an emotional gauntlet. This time, as she sat across from him, separated by the thick glass, she saw a change. The anger and bitterness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, settled sadness, an acceptance. "You look good, Amelia," he said through the crackling phone, his voice raspy. "I'm okay, Dad," she replied, and for the first time she meant it. "I'm teaching art." She told him about her students, about how they used art to confront their own demons. Michael listened, a sad smile touching his lips. "Your mother would have been proud," he said. A silence stretched between them. "I'm sorry," he finally said, the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. "Not for wanting to protect you, but for how I did it. I took your pain and made it mine, and then I put an even greater weight back on you. That wasn't fair." "I know," Amelia whispered, placing her hand on the glass. "I know you love me, but I had to learn to save myself. You couldn't do that for me." As the visiting hour ended and Michael was led away, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had lost everything, but his daughter, somehow, had found her way. She had survived. She was stronger than he had ever been. It was a small, quiet redemption, but in his gray world, it felt like sunshine. On the long drive home from the prison, Amelia stopped for gas. Inside, while paying, she saw Julian Thorne's book on a rack. His smug face stared back at her from the cover. A cold dread washed over her. The old, familiar anger swelled in her chest. He had won. He had taken their story, twisted it, and sold it for profit. But then, she looked out the window at the open road ahead. She thought of the students waiting for her, of the quiet life she had built. Julian Thorne still existed, and the world still held men like him. But he no longer had power over her. He was just an echo from another life, a scar that had faded with time. She paid for her gas, walked out of the store, and didn't look back. She got in her car, started the engine, and drove toward the horizon, leaving the past to shrink behind her in the rearview mirror.